I think I have a pretty open and unabashed love for Sanskrit as a language, and especially the vast literary tradition of things that are written in Sanskrit. I mean, that's how I got into the study of South Asia. That was the hook, really, that sort of kept me here, was when I started studying Sanskrit. So I absolutely love it. I think that there's so much richness in the tradition that has not been known and appreciated in modern times.
So adding to that, which one is older, Sanskrit or Persian?
Sanskrit versus modern Persian, Sanskrit. What we call Persian now, we mean modern Persian. It also exists in Middle Persian, pre-modern versions, and Avestan. Avestan goes back as far as Sanskrit does. But that's very different than modern Persian. So the short answer, Sanskrit. I mean, I've faced, I think, pretty robust pushback against my scholarship and against what people perceive as my scholarship. I gotta say, if I had said like a quarter of the things that people think that I have said based on social media and WhatsApp chatter, I would hate me too. Folks, it's not real. Like, the disinformation campaigns are very, very robust. So whatever you think you know about me, you probably don't. Just actually read my books. I think you'll be surprised at what's in there.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I'm Mithilesh and Sumit welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian, SuShri Audrey Truschke. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Today we will discuss Audrey Truschke's book, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narrative of a Muslim Past. The Language of History analyzes a hitherto overlooked groups of histories on Indo-Muslim or Indo-Persian political events, namely a few dozen of Sanskrit texts that date from the 1190s until 1721. Indian Sanskrit scholars produced dozens of Sanskrit texts on Muslim-initiated political events. These works span Delhi Sultanate, Mughal rule, including texts that deal with Deccan sultanates and Muslim-led polities in the subcontinent's deep south. The book seeks for the first time to collect, analyze, and theorize Sanskrit histories of Muslim late and the later as Muslim became an integral part of Indian culture and political worlds, Indo-Muslim rule as a body of historical materials. Audrey Truscke is a historian, author, and activist. She is an associate professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University at Newark, New Jersey. She is the author of two award-winning books, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth. So Audrey, how did the Language of History, the book, happen?
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really my pleasure. The story of how this book came about, I'm afraid, is a very academic story. I was doing research for my first book, which originally was my dissertation and then became my first book. And I found an entire body of text of Jain-authored works that talked about events at the Mughal courts. These texts were not meant for the Mughals. As far as I know, the Mughals never knew about them, much less read them or knew their contents. They were for internal Jain consumption. And this didn't exactly fit in to my dissertation / first book. Now, I sort of made it fit in. I do have a chapter on these texts, but there was far more. I mean, those texts alone constitute thousands of printed pages of Sanskrit materials. Very little, if any, of those have been translated into English. And so they're not widely known. They're not widely available. So I sort of set that aside, as scholars do, and I thought, okay, I'm going to come back to that. I intended to write the language of history for my second book, but then Aurangzeb Alamgir interrupted and disrupted my life for several years, as he has for so many individuals over the last 400 plus years. So after the Aurangzeb book, then I went back to the language of history, and starting from these Jain-authored materials that were focused on Mughal context, I looked for what I could find, that came before, that came after, and that was beyond Jain circles. And I found a robust body of materials. And so the book deals in total with about 36 Sanskrit texts that I call histories, and I lay out my arguments for that in the book. And they all talk about different kinds of Indo-Muslim dynasties.
So researching rich Sanskrit texts, what challenges did you face? What are your views on Sanskrit at its richness and its richness?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think I have a pretty open and unabashed love for Sanskrit as a language, and especially the vast literary tradition of things that are written in Sanskrit. That's how I got into the study of South Asia. That was the hook, really, that sort of kept me here, was when I started studying Sanskrit. So I absolutely love it. I think that there's so much richness in the tradition that has not been known and appreciated in modern times. And I suppose in terms of challenges, the first challenge is the language itself. Sanskrit is a difficult language to learn. Even after you have learned it grammatically and read text for many years, you go to a new genre or even just a new author, and it's almost like you're starting all over again. Right? There's just so many different ways to write in Sanskrit in pre-modernity. It's an endless challenge, which is both invigorating and also frustrating. I think another challenge that I faced, particularly with this book, is how do you work through an immense amount of materials, right? 36 Sanskrit texts. Individually, some of them were pretty short, so I could read the whole thing, but others would be hundreds of pages in print. And I should say most of the texts are printed, so I actually do have page counts for most of them. And how do you deal with that kind of material? How do you approach it? So I had to sort of rely on a set of reading strategies to sort of get through these materials and to pinpoint parts that I wanted to read. The last thing that I would point out is that most of the texts that I work on have never been translated into English, so I don't have translations to rely on. And perhaps more importantly for me as a Sanskritist, they didn't have commentaries, because that's the go-to for Sanskritists. English translations are great. It's fine. It's great when we can, do a quick double check with that. But what I really want is a pre-modern Sanskrit intellectual who read a work written in the 15th century. Maybe they read it in the 17th century, and they said what they thought about it. And they gloss words and they say how they interpret compounds. If possible, I want multiple commentaries so that I can see divergent views. And I would have to double check. I don't think any of the texts I worked on had more than one commentary, with possibly one exception, and most of them had no commentaries. So that was quite a challenge.
So how did you get into Sanskrit? There are scholars who work on different languages, but why Sanskrit for you?
So this story, it's a very academic story. I guess most of my stories are academic now that I reflect on this point. So I went to college at the age of 17 to study religion. Religion is the most longstanding interest in my life. And when I went to college, I sort of assumed that I would study Christianity and Judaism because I come from the American Midwest. I did not grow up in a particularly diverse community. That is what religion meant to me at the young age of 17. And then I got to college, and there was a class being offered on the Mahabharata. And I had no idea what that was. I had no idea how to say it. So I looked it up, right, in like a book in a library. And I was like, oh, that's a Hindu text. Well, Hinduism is a major world religion that I know absolutely nothing about. And if I'm going to major in religious studies, I should know something about that tradition. So I enroll in this class, and I am thrown into this epic story. I remember that one of the first assignments in the class was to read 3 different shortened versions of the Mahabharata. And so especially for folks who have grown up with this, like, try to imagine just being thrown into this, like all the names, all the stories, all the gods. I had absolutely no background to understand this. So I was fascinated, and I was utterly confused. And I sort of love a challenge. I identified my confusion as my problem. And so I set out to learn. And that's what I was in college to do. And so my next step, I thought, I had to take a language anyways. And so I thought, well, why not take Sanskrit? That's the language of this fantastic, marvelous story that I want to understand more about. And it's more interesting, than, biblical Greek, which would be a more normal language for a religious studies major in the United States. So I was like, okay, I'll take Sanskrit. So then I go to my Sanskrit class. I'm 18 by this point in time. And this is all in my memory, so I can't vouch for full historical accuracy, but in my memory, on the first day of class, there were 20 students, okay? And we learned the alphabet, right? The Devanagari script.
Oh.
Then on the second day of class, there were only 10 students, and we started learning sandhi, okay, which is the series of phonetic changes between letters and sounds. Okay, so then on the third day of class, we start learning grammar. We're down to 5 students. And I mentioned that I like a challenge, right? And so in the course of learning Sanskrit that first year, at some point I figured out that there is a vast and, relative to Western text, understudied literature available in Sanskrit. And I guess I've just been reading it ever since.
Yeah, great story. So do you think, why is it that, so obviously, there are very few books or scholars who currently work on Sanskrit texts. And would you say that how much of Sanskrit texts actually contain history and how much of it is historical fiction?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I think it's not so easy to divide those two, especially for premodernity. And in part, really maybe in entirety, this depends on what you want to know, right? So I would say this: all pre-modern histories that I have ever encountered from any tradition mix fact and fiction. Okay, that's true of Persian medium histories. I know that people continue to read Indo-Persian histories, mainly in their English translations, and think that they are the God-given truth, and that is incorrect. That is a very uncritical and false way to read these texts. And yet it remains popular, especially outside of academic circles. So Sanskrit is not unusual in having works that mix fact and fiction. And I think we have to keep in mind that the idea of sort of separating out what really happened, to a great degree, that is a modern concern. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in pre-modernity, but I think that is a hallmark of modernity in the modern discipline of history. Now, I live in 2021, like we all do. I am a modern historian. I am committed to history in that sense. And I think especially given sort of virulent Hindu right-wing pushback on the basic facts of history, I am invested in that project of sort of clarifying what did and did not happen in the past. I would also hate to be circumscribed by that. And so in the language of history, what the sort of move I make is that I argue that yes, you can mine pre-modern Sanskrit histories for little tidbits of historical facts, and I even signal a couple of texts that I think would be particularly good to do that with. Okay, Lakshmipati's twinned works that I end the book with, notable on that front. But that's not my project. I want to know what was history to them. I know it wasn't what history is to me. It did not have to be completely truthful at all times. And what I identified that we share in common is a desire to narrativize the past and to tell a coherent story about it that makes sense for me in my time and for the pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals I discuss in the book in their own respective times. And I prioritize trying to figure out what their rules were. Right? They're largely unspoken rules. What were their norms? What were the varying views of history and historicity that were at play in their minds?
Adding to that, Sanskrit archives as the source of history are often criticized, while Persian texts of Abul Fazal and Firishta et al. Are widely accepted. Why so?
I think colonialism is your short answer to that. But let me elaborate, because sometimes people just blame colonialism for everything, right? Like, I woke up with a headache. Colonialism did it. And that's a very unhelpful way to go about your lived experience. Anyways, so I think what happened is that the British show up and they're like, "Yo, folks, where's your history?" Right? And the British have a very specific idea about what history is. It needs to go in order, right? You need to have chronology, you need dates. Okay, a lot of Sanskrit history is written without dates, not all of it, but that's a fairly common, is to omit the dates. They're like, we need to know who wrote it and who they were. Okay, Indo-Persian writers tend to be fairly forthcoming about that, whereas the norms of pre-modern Sanskrit discourse, one tended to obscure who the writer was. That was just sort of the way it was done. Mm-hmm. So basically, I think that there are certain features of Indo-Persian histories that fit better into the British conception of what written history should be. Of course, the British were not looking at Indo-Persian histories entirely in order to recover the past. That was part of their project, right? There was, an intellectual part of the British project there. But there was also a propaganda part, and they wanted to use Indo-Persian histories in order to reconstruct a certain kind of history that would justify what should have been unjustifiable, namely British colonialism. And I think that Indo-Persian texts lent themselves a bit better to that project.
I forgot to show this to our audience. This is a wonderful research book, and I thoroughly read it, and I had to read it again and again because there were so many references and so many scripture and their translations. So I appreciate this work, and I urge the audience to read it before saying anything. So thank you for this book.
Thank you.
Early Muslims in India were addressed by Sanskrit scholars with different names, such as Tajika, Turushka, Yavana, and a few places Malaysia. Is there any etymology behind these nomenclatures, or was it just a personal choice of authors?
I don't think those are exclusive. Yes, of course, it was the personal choice of the authors, but yeah, I think that there's more to it. I don't think, Jayanaka just woke up one day and he was like, what am I going to call these people? Tajika. We'll just go with that. So I think there was a bit more to it than that. And I traced this for specific terms in the book. So for example, for Tajika and Turushka, right? So Tajik and Turk, respectively, those are pseudo-ethnonyms. Okay, and I call them ethnonyms or wannabe ethnonyms or pseudo-ethnonyms in the book because their use in Sanskrit was not restricted to ethnic groups. So Tajika does not only refer to Tajiks, Turushka does not only refer to Turks. That quickly comes to mean like any Muslim or even like Muslim adjacent sort of individual. I do have something, speculation really, informed speculation. Let's say I have an informed speculation in the book about why. Why would you go to ethnonyms? I mean, you could have just adapted Muslim into Sanskrit, and people do, okay, including very early, right? We have around a 700 CE usage of Musulmana, that would be Sanskrit for Muslim. So it was clearly a choice. And my informed speculation is basically that what God people were worshiping, what the religious book was, those were not the primary concerns to Sanskrit intellectuals in terms of thinking about different kinds of Muslim communities and how they were impacting life in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. Rather, the pseudo-ethnonyms somehow did that work a bit better. I trace vocabulary use on and off throughout the book because it never gets ironed out. Right? Sanskrit intellectuals never come up with a sort of, we're just going to call Muslims X, and we're just all going to run with it. So they never settle the vocabulary question, and I take great comfort in that because we haven't settled that vocabulary question today either. Scholars are all over the map. With even me in my own work, I'm all over the map. When we talk about Muslims in pre-modernity, do we call them Muslim, Indo-Muslim, Indo-Persian, Persianate, Islamic, Islamicate? I mean, I could go on at some length. And that scholarly discomfort, at times, at least to me, it can seem tedious. But then I read Sanskrit intellectuals over hundreds of years, and I'm like, okay, they couldn't figure it out either. And these are some pretty smart dudes, right? I think one virtue of the diverse vocabulary is that it allows us to see authorial choice. Right. So, for example, when I read 17th century texts from Shivaji's court in Maharashtra, and they start using tamra and tamranana, red and red-faced for Muslims, I didn't see that earlier. So then I can ask, well, why? Why would those terms be coming up now? It's not mere convention. There has to be another external reason.
So during for your project, and you must have read a lot of books, do you see the description or the usage of these words actually changed over the time as the relationship of this region changed with the Muslim world? I mean, because probably earlier it was more economic than it actually went to more maybe into invasion, etc. So obviously the relationship must have changed over the years. Does that reflect in the literature?
That's a great question. I would honestly have to reflect more on that. I don't think I made an attempt in the book to tie vocabulary shifts to kind of larger social and cultural changes on quite that scale. But one thing that I can comment on, and I'll give you the example of the word Malaysia. Okay, so Malaysia is an old Sanskrit word. It way predates the existence of Muslims anywhere in the world, and it means impure outsider. Right? That's sort of basically what it means. It's been applied to a whole lot of different groups. Even in 2021, people who don't like me call me Malaysia. So we still have it being applied today. And when Muslims come on the scene, they're obviously Malaysia, right? Meaning specifically that they are outside of the Varna system, they're ritually impure, they cannot participate in Vedic rites, things like that. And yet then it originally sort of just means that. And then at a certain point, for a lot of authors, it seems to just mean Muslim, sort of neutrally, like not positive, not negative, which is very jarring if you're used to reading about Malaysia in the context of sort of Vedic sacrificial discourse, where it's always negative. And then at a certain point, especially when we get to close to the Mughal period, it's used positively, right? So the Mughals are called Malaycha Rajas, right? So, kings of the Malaychas. And this is not like, oh, those dirty Mughals. This isn't like smears against the Mughals today. Like this is meant in my reading, at least, as a positive epithet. So you see great flexibility, I think, in the vocabulary. And I guess that's an instance where you could tie it to Indo-Muslim rule becoming more widespread in India.
So I understand. I mean, obviously, the focus of your book is on Sanskrit literature. But do you think? Are you working on, let's say, some of the history? What lies there in the regional texts, in the text of the regional languages, or is there? Are you going to come back to that, or is that a focus of your research?
You mean original languages besides Sanskrit?
Yeah, for instance, Telugu, or let's say, for instance, Assami, or maybe other regional languages of India, because the texts must have been written in the past in those regional languages. So there must be deep history about the time period.
So that's a great question. Most of my research does center around Sanskrit and Persian materials. I do read Hindi. I read a certain amount of Braj Bhasha, a form of pre-modern Hindi. But I would not be capable of doing extensive work on Braj Bhasha histories, not without help. That would be a bit beyond what I would feel comfortable with. That said, I recognize my own limitations. I'm only one scholar, and I agree that I think the way forward here is to bring in more and more regional histories. I think that each region is probably going to be really different. As you all probably know, and many of your listeners probably know, regional literature in South Indian languages tends to predate literature in North Indian languages, right? So Tamil, Telugu, Kannada tends to predate your Hindi, Bangla, so on and so forth materials. A lot of that across the board is also heavily under-researched. And I look forward to other scholars coming along and doing more and more work in this regard. And I know of a number of scholars who are doing more regionally focused materials.
Yeah, good to hear. Good to hear that people are trying to source this material and try to figure out what's right. I mean, the more you do it, the better you learn about history. You have read so many books in the Sanskrit literature. What do you find? Let's say, you have to point out three things you learned from this literature, which people didn't know about history. How did it change your view of Indian history or that period?
You mean for this book or in general? For the book?
In general, but what you have learned from the Sanskrit literature. How did it help, and how did it revise your understanding of the history of that time period after reading this book?
That's a very difficult question. Three things.
Top three. Yeah, I'm sure
right.
There are other things, but top.
So I guess thinking about the book specifically, I think my biggest takeaway is that there was a lot of diversity in views from elite writers in Sanskrit, which is somewhat redundant. Almost anyone writing in Sanskrit in pre-modernity was almost definitionally elite. So there's a huge diversity of views among elite Sanskrit writers in pre-modernity regarding how to think about Muslim-led dynasties and Muslims as a people, and particularly Muslims who had political power. There's very little consistency. There's not uniformity. There's not even one way to other them or one way to include them. And I guess, when you finish a book project, you realize assumptions that you might have had at the beginning that have been overthrown. And I don't think I ever thought through this assumption, but I guess I sort of walked in with the idea that you can otherize someone and you can include them. But I didn't necessarily consciously think about diversity within those approaches. And that's really what I found in the book to take away.
So what do you mean by diversity here? I mean, it was not clear to me, at least.
So, okay, for example, speaking about inclusivity. So let me give you two examples: Ganga Devi versus Lakshmipati. So Ganga Devi's writing in the 14th century, and she's writing about the Vijayanagara complete annihilation of the Sultanate of Madurai. So this is a case of extreme political violence. One dynasty kills off another. So when she's writing about the Sultanate of Madurai, she writes about them as if they are no different from any other kingdom, right? And so, we would identify that Sultanate as Muslim today, in contrast to Vijayanagara, which we would identify as Hindu. But one thing I did in the book is I compared Ganga Devi's depiction of the Sultanate to the Sambhuvarayas, who were another enemy of the Vijayanagara Empire at the time. We would identify them as Hindu today too. So we have one quote Hindu enemy, one quote Muslim enemy, and the language in which they're described is it's really almost identical, right? I have several cases where I just parallel things in the book. That is a form of inclusivity, right? That I'm going to describe my enemy like any other enemy. They're part of the scene. Various dynasties are going to war. Writing about that is beyond normal in pre-modern Sanskrit discourse. Right? So I see inclusion in that, even in this case of recording political violence. That's very different than Lakshmipati, who's writing in the early 18th century. For him, there is no sense in which anyone who is Muslim is the other, but he shows it through things like using Persian words and Persian vocabulary and referencing bits of Mughal history and describing things that honestly we might expect in a Persian text. And I raised that question at one point in the book, why wasn't this written in Persian instead of Sanskrit? That is a different way of including what we might incorrectly think of today as the Muslim other. Right? So in both cases, Muslim political dynasties were not the other. They were welcome and included in the respective authors' worldviews, but in very different ways.
That's very interesting, actually.
Jayanaka's Prithvirajavijaya stands out as largely unique text that can help us recover how India's traditional learned elite thought about Ghurid invasion. Why is Jayanaka so important to understand the Sanskrit narrative of Muslim past?
So I start with Jayanaka in terms of full text because it's the first one we've got. It's the first full text that we know about, or at least that survives. I should note, I guess it actually does not fully survive. It exists in a fragmentary form. We have a single fragmentary manuscript, which leads to a lot of words missing in various verses. And then the text just cuts off entirely, I believe in the middle of chapter 12, if memory serves. So we don't have the end, okay? But we have enough. We have enough of Jayanaka's full text. And he's important because he's the first. He's important because he's writing essentially in real time. He writes between 1191 and 1200. So we have a 9-year span at most. Most scholars think it was written closer to 1191. I hedge on that point in the book. I don't have a clear opinion on that. But in any case, 9-year period. That's pretty precise. And he's writing about the 1191 Ghurid attempt to take over the Chauhan Empire, okay, which was based in Ajmer. So by the way, if you thought the Chauhans were based in Delhi, that's a bit of later propaganda. That's not true. Anyways, 1192, of course, is the rematch, okay, when the Ghurids are actually successful. In 1191, the Chauhans win. In 1192, the Ghurids win. And so I read Jayanaka's text. It was possibly the first, I think, yeah, it was the first full text I sat down and read for the book project because it was the first one, and I was going in chronological order. That made good sense. I expected to find othering in these texts. I did not expect to find what Jayanaka had on offer. Like, it is a form of othering and xenophobia that is, it's just, there's not a lot of nuance, I would say, in those regards. There's nuance in other ways to Prithvirajavijaya, but man, that guy had no room for the Ghurids as, you know, as Indian in any possible construal of that word. And I didn't expect to find that. And actually, I distinctly remember after reading the text, the first time through, I was like, wow, this is going to be a different book than I thought it was going to be if all of these texts are like this. Like, this is not what I was expecting to find. And let me be clear that if I had continued to read and other texts had been like Jayanaka's in its extreme othering of the Ghurids and other people who came later, I would have written a different book. That's what scholars do. You follow the evidence wherever it leads. But as it turns out, Jayanaka is different. Nobody else others like he does, not in such an extreme way. And so to me, he stands out as this early moment when you're just seeing what we now call Indo-Muslim or Indo-Persian rule begin. And we often talk about this date, 1192. Right? And I mean, Jayanaka, obviously in real time, something about that struck him. Something about that struck him as important enough to write a whole text about the events of the prior year. So he identified it as important, but as I said, it stands out as this moment of difference where he did not see how the Ghurids could become Indian in any way. And that changes by the time we get to the next set of texts in the 14th century. Tracing what changed and how inclusion became possible in this wide variety of ways, we have to rely on inscriptions, because that's what we have from the 13th century to sort of fill in the gaps. We don't have full text, which isn't to say that they never existed, but is to say that if they did, they didn't survive.
So would you say, when it comes to Prithvirajraso, for instance, right? I mean, it's a book about the same events, but I think there is disagreement about when it was actually written. I think probably it was definitely later than after, definitely post 1200, sometime after that. So what differences do you see, I mean, between the two texts? I mean, would you say that one is, would you say, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's about the same events, but what differences, or would you say, I mean, are there?
So the Prithvirajavijaya is in Sanskrit. Okay, the Prithvirajraso is a vernacular work. The Prithvirajavijaya, Jayanaka's text, it was written by somebody very close to the events. Jayanaka was in the Ajmer-based Chauhan court. He was possibly an eyewitness to some of the events that he describes, and that's pretty important for historians. The Prithvirajraso, the bulk of that was written in the 16th century. And there's different recensions of it. So there's actually surprisingly different versions of that work. Cynthia Talbot has an excellent book on this, The Last Hindu King, I believe it's called. So I encourage people to check that out. It's a great book. They're very different. But I will say one thing that happens is in some of the later Sanskrit texts that I work on in the book, you see stories that we also see in the Raso coming into Sanskrit literature, which suggests quite strongly that there was cross-fertilization between the two. I think the general fact that Sanskrit and vernacular literatures interact, or the people who write them interact, and stories go back and forth, I think all scholars agree on that as a general thing, but we can't always see it so precisely. So I think there's more to be done there in terms of tracing how Prithviraj's story develops over time in pre-modernity.
Ganga Devi, queen of Madurai, the Vijayanagara Empire, wrote ahead of her time, where education was alien stuff for most of the ladies of that time. How Ganga Devi's Madhurvijaya contribute to history?
So I love Ganga Devi's text. obviously it's by a woman. It's the only text by a woman in the book. I wish, and we do actually, by the way, have a fair amount of Sanskrit text written by women. J.B. Chowdhury has, I think, a 2-volume set of books on female contributions to Sanskrit literature. So I want to be clear, women didn't write nearly as much as men. Knowledge was circumscribed largely to men, but not entirely, right? So one has to be nuanced on these points. In terms of I should say the second reason why I really love Ganga Devi's text is it's really good. Okay, just in terms of the quality of the Sanskrit poetry, like she was a very good poet in my opinion. I'm not going to name names, but not every poet I read for this book was quite as good as Ganga Devi. So women doing better than men, even in the 14th century. Other contributions to history, besides outshining some of her male peers. So for me, finding her work, I don't know, I hadn't thought much about the Sultanate of Madurai. And I think being able to bring that up and in the book, I think it was pretty important. And in research for the book, I actually went to Madurai and I tried to find all traces of the Sultanate that I could. And I was surprised when I first set out to do that, I was like, oh man, I'm just going to wander around. I'm going to go to the Meenakshi temple and that's it. There's not how much could possibly be left from this Sultanate that lasted 40 years, 600 years ago. What could be left? Turns out there's actually a lot left. There's mosques, there's foundations, there's 3 graves of the sultans of Madurai in 2 different Sufi dargahs. So I was really surprised at how much I found. And I was also surprised at how much local people were aware of this. And that's obviously a reflection of my own ignorance, that I was not aware of the degree of local knowledge of these traditions. And I'm sure there's many things to say about that. But one thing to say is that the narrative of Indian history is still a North India-centric story. Right? That's still a very persistent, real problem. I think of myself as a recovering North India hegemon. Okay, my training very much centers me in the North, and I am constantly trying to correct on that. And I'm working right now on a 1-volume history of India, an overview history over several thousand years. And one of the key guiding principles of this book, ethical obligations for me, is I do not want to repeat the North India-centric narrative. That's been done too many times. So I'm really trying and struggling in a positive way to bring South India in a little bit more. And in the language of history, Ganga Devi allowed me to bring the South into the story early on.
Well, Kashmiri Rajatarangini, which was started by Kalhana and carried forward by Jonaraja Srivara, how Rajatarangini helped shape the history of Kashmir and India at that time.
So the Rajatarangini, so this body of text, they're the one exception to the widespread assumption still that there's no written history in Sanskrit, right? It's always there's no written history except Kalhana, right? He's this unicorn book. And I very much did not want to repeat that because I think that it is analytically and intellectually bankrupt, not to mention completely inaccurate. So I really wanted to situate Kalhana in this longer series of Rajataranginis, right, plural. And I also wanted to situate this body of Kashmiri text in a wider context. And so I deal with them in half a chapter where the other half is on Gujarati Jain works. So I present them as 2 sort of regional focused traditions. Now, all that said, the Rajataranginis, they offer an immense amount of historical information as well as literary information and thoughts on historicity and historical thinking. They're an extraordinary set of works, and there's far more to do there. And I have a number of colleagues, especially Luther Obrock, who's doing much of that work, which is fantastic. In terms of what they allow us to see, I think maybe one interesting thing and unique thing to point out about some of the Rajataranginis is that I think they're the only histories in my book that were written for Muslims, right? Not all of them, Kalhana wasn't, but Jonaraja and Srivara were official historians for the Shahmiri dynasty in Kashmir, which I think it just blows out of the water all of our assumptions about who is working for who and writing in what language for kings of what religion.
would you say that? Or that's what our perception is, that when it comes to historical writing about, let's say, in the medieval era, you have more writings available in Persian and less in Sanskrit. Of course, is it because? First of all, why is it that?
So I mean, if you printed all these texts out and you stacked them up on a table, probably there would be more in the Persian stack than the Sanskrit stack. That's probably true. Although I say probably because I don't think that I or anyone else has the depth of knowledge to actually make that assessment very, very clearly. That said, just because one group might outweigh the other doesn't mean you should ignore it, right? And so that's what I'm trying to push back against in the book. It's not that I think that Sanskrit history should take precedence over Indo-Persian histories. I do not think that. And it's not that I think that everybody has to learn Sanskrit to work on the Indo-Muslim period, although I think some people should probably learn Sanskrit to work on the Indo-Muslim period. It's that I just want them included. I want them in the club, right? If you ignore histories in one of the two major literary traditions that existed across India in pre-modernity, right? You have Sanskrit and Persian. Those are your two big ones that span the whole subcontinent. Well, you're missing a huge part of the storyline, right? And so is it any surprise then that there are entire aspects of especially Hindu-Muslim relations, to use modern terminology, in pre-modernity that we have missed out on, right? And these texts offer a wealth of information in that regard. And let me say that I know not everyone can learn Sanskrit, which breaks my heart. But practically speaking, I do offer a series of excerpted translations in the back of the book. And that's why I do it. It is a gesture at making some of this material available for folks to teach, to use, to cite in their own research.
Obviously, a large part of Sanskrit texts have been lost, let's say, for instance, in the Nalanda and other parts, right? Other events which had taken place. But what is left? For instance, at times you do find out something like Arthasastra, which was found accidentally. That's what I understand. Do you think such texts are lying around in in some places and they are yet to be found out? There's a huge wealth of information which has not been uncovered yet.
Yes, I do, and I don't know what it is. Now you can't know what you don't know, but you can know you don't know stuff. And I know that I don't know stuff here. And so why do I think that? So there are millions of handwritten manuscripts from pre-modern times that exist in the modern nation state of India. You start going to Pakistan and Bangladesh, there's even more. And a huge percentage of those are in Sanskrit. And obviously a lot of those are repeat texts, but some probably aren't. Who knows? And I even have cases where, I've looked at manuscript catalogs and I know there's a text with a really intriguing title, but going to India is not a very realistic option at present. So I can't get to those materials. I think there's so much more. I would point out that to some degree, it is a race against time. So the Indian climate is really bad for manuscript preservation, okay? And as a result, it's pretty rare to even have handwritten manuscripts from, say, the 15th century in India. The vast majority of our handwritten manuscripts are from the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. Many of those record older texts, but the actual copies we have were copied later. And that's because paper and bark and leaves, it just doesn't survive in a hot, humid climate. So those manuscripts aren't going to survive forever. And manuscript archives and libraries in India are highly variable in their resources and the job that they do with those resources in preserving manuscripts. And to a great degree, that's very understandable. But I'm not the only scholar. In fact, most scholars I know who work on manuscripts have had this experience of walking into an Indian archive and asking to see a text, and you pick it up and it crumbles in your hand. And obviously, at that point, you set down the rest of the manuscript, and it goes into preservation mode, right? You don't continue to destroy it. That's never intentional. But it's just a reminder. So last thing I would say is I don't know how well we're doing with this race against time. anti-intellectual currents in modern Indian society are very robust and very powerful, right? There's a lot of resources devoted not to helping scholars like me who want to know about pre-modern Indian past, but rather trying to stop my research and the research of others. And that's not going to go very well for people actually reading pre-modern manuscripts.
All right. So you have mentioned a quote from Prabandh Chintamani by Meru Tunga, where around 1235 CE, Queen Nike Devi defeated Muhammad Ghori on Mount Abu Hills. However, Muhammad Ghori's defeat in Mount Abu is largely contested among historians. What's your view on that?
Okay, that's a very specific question. I would have to review the details of that to recall what my opinion was on that. To be perfectly frank, I do not recall what conclusion I came to, if I came to a conclusion on the hard historicity of that event. But the Prabandha Chintamani in general has a lot of more imaginary stuff in the Indian past. Its view of historicity is certainly not close to my view of historicity. And so I think that the question for us to ask is, when you change the past and you make up stuff about it, why? What purpose does that serve, right? You don't just change stuff to change stuff. You do that because there is some set of purposes served in your present day.
Right. So moving ahead, Jain monks wrote elaborate accounts of their time through their prabandhas. How did Jain monks help carry forward Sanskrit legacy, which was under Brahminical shadow?
So, okay, Sanskrit hadn't been owned by Brahmins exclusively for a long time by the time Jain monks were writing about the Mughal court. So in broad strokes, the story here, Sanskrit originally is a Brahmanical thing. It's a Brahmanical invention, and access was tightly controlled. And so about 1,000 years after the development of Vedic Sanskrit, when Buddhism and Jainism come along, they don't want to use Sanskrit, right? Because it's part of what they're working against. Right? Sanskrit is the language of Brahmanical ritual. They don't want anything to do with that, right? Because they think the Brahmanical ritual is worthless, and that's why they're founding new religions in part. That goes on for several hundred years, but it shifts. It shifts around the turn into the CE, sort of era, so about 2,000 years ago. And that is when you start to see Jains, Buddhists, and others adopt Sanskrit as a language that they can use. So from that point forward, there are still a bunch of Brahmins who try to have a stranglehold on Sanskrit and, try various, sort of domination techniques and so on and so forth. That's all there. But there's also a bunch of Jains and Buddhists until they largely die out, writing in this language as well. So by the time we come to the Mughal court, Jains have been writing in Sanskrit for well over 1,000 years, right? I mean, this is like a thing that's been going on. And so I think for them, it was just sort of a normal thing to do. I would flag that one interesting thing about the pre-modern Sanskrit intellectual universe in general is that Jains appear largely to be reading a very wide range of materials. So they're reading what Brahmins are writing. It's also clear that that goes the other way around, right? So there may have been more openness on one side than the other.
Do you, when we read about our current history, there is a lot of propaganda, because of colonialism. Do you see same kind of propaganda in Sanskrit texts as well? Not in the context.
No, I hear you. Yeah. So, is it the same as colonial propaganda? I think no. I think we agree on that. But sure, massaging information to promote a certain set of political or cultural objectives, that's a pretty old bag of tricks. Right? The British didn't come up with that. Of course, you see that in Sanskrit literature. I think what gets more complicated and interesting is exactly on behalf of whom, right? So Jains at the Mughal court, for instance, they're not writing for the Mughals, not in the text, for another text, yes, but not in the text that I'm looking at in this book. They're writing for their own community. So they're representing Mughal power in very specific ways, but the motivations have to do with internal Jain dynamics, often internal Gacha or sectarian sort of dynamics, so specific branches within Shvetambara Jainism. In contrast, when you're looking at Jonaraja and Srivara, who are getting direct state sponsorship, it would be hard for me to not see some Shahmiri intervention there. But of course, I don't think the Kashmiri kings overall knew Sanskrit, at least not particularly well, although maybe they did. So then you get complicated. Can you influence in a language you don't know? And this, of course, looks different than for somebody like Ganga Devi, who is part of the royal center of power, right? She's a queen.
Right. So, as you discussed in your book, Jain monks had respectable relationship with Akbar. Once Akbar banned animal slaughter during one of the Jain's festivals. Why this Jain a strong relationship with the royal court later disintegrated?
Yeah, so Akbar, he banned animal slaughter during Paryushan or Paryushana, the sort of multi-day Jain festival. So I think there's a couple things to say about this. One is that it's not clear that those bans were effective. And I covered this in my first book, more Culture of Encounters. But one sign that those bans, like no one followed them, at least for a long time, is that when Jahangir comes along, Akbar's son, he issues an almost identical order. So like if people were following the first order, why do we need a second order? It suggests the first order was not being followed. The relationship between Jain monks and the Mughal courts, it falls apart in a sort of sustained way with Jahangir. And it's not entirely clear what happened. There are a couple of moments. There's a Jain dude who predicted that Jahangir would only sit on the throne for a couple of years. Like you understand why Jahangir didn't really appreciate that. Okay, so that's sort of like soured relations. But there's also some fairly critical stuff that Jahangir writes. It's somewhat cryptic, but some critical stuff about Shvetambara Jainism and the Jain monks with whom he has interacted. And he sort of banishes them from the Mughal court. Once sort of temporarily, second time also temporarily, but they seem to never recover after that. From my perspective, in this book, in the language of history, what is most astonishing about this is that for decades after Shvetambara Jain monks from Gujarat had lost their consistent relations with the Mughal court, for decades after, they still wrote about it. So it didn't exist in reality, right? This was a broken relationship, but they continue to write about it at great length in Sanskrit texts, and probably in Gujarati texts as well that I just cannot read. And so the question for me then is, well, why? What work was that doing for their community building? Obviously, I shouldn't say it's obvious. I argue that the specific forms of Mughal power were useful for how these Jain communities in Gujarat wanted to self-articulate themselves and their religious ideas and mission using political ideology and political imagery.
Yeah, so how did Sanskrit Cosmos merging with Persian Cosmos resulted from the development of new vernaculars that help India attain modern diversity?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
So, like my argument is that Sanskrit Cosmos, the Sanskrit culture merged with Persian culture at the advent of Muslims. So, how this phenomenon help development of vernaculars languages in India?
That's interesting. I don't know. That's my short answer. I don't know. I think that's an intriguing argument. I'm just not clear. I have immediate thoughts on it.
Sure. So I understand that. I mean, in your book, you do look at the texts and you find that how the language has changed over the time. So do you see that the language Sanskrit itself has evolved over the time?
Oh, sure. Of course. So on the one hand, Sanskrit in some ways develops less than other languages. And that's because it's an artificial language to a great degree, meaning that it was sort of people made it into what it was in this sort of formalized way with a specific type of grammar fairly early on. So it's not subjected to quite the same sorts of shifts as vernaculars are, right? Where, I can't read Chaucer. Chaucer's allegedly in English, but I can't say I agree. That is not English that I understand. Sanskrit's not like that. We do have Sanskrit texts that are not dated, and we can't tell with it, like our date range is like 1,000 years. because the language is not sufficiently differentiated enough for us to say, okay, this is 500 versus 1500 CE. That said, especially within more specific kinds of discourses and specific genres, I think one can see more of a development. And that's something I certainly see with changing vocabulary that we talked about earlier regarding Muslims and Sanskrit literature. There are certain things that change in a historical sense over time periods like that. Certainly the inclusion of Persian words that can help you with dating. So.
Yeah, so adding to that, which one is older, Sanskrit or Persian?
Sanskrit versus modern Persian, Sanskrit. What we call Persian now, we mean modern Persian. It also exists in Middle Persian, pre-modern versions, and Avestan. Avestan goes back as far as Sanskrit does. But that's very different than modern Persian. So the short answer, Sanskrit.
So most of the books which you have read, I mean, were they poetry or they were more, were they poetry?
Yes. I think probably most pre-modern Sanskrit stuff is poetry. That or philosophy. Whew. Anyways, so yes, and they're poetry in the sense that they're written in meter or verse. I do have prose works I deal with in the book, particularly by Jains. But most of it is the bulk of the text are in meter and verse, and so they are poetry. And as I argue in the book, I think that they're literary histories. They're fully literature and they're fully history. We don't have to choose, and we shouldn't because they didn't. The authors did not. They thought they could partake in both.
All right. So one more question. What was the position of Sanskrit scholars during Aurangzeb time?
Oh, so most Sanskrit scholars in Aurangzeb's period had nothing to do with Aurangzeb and just continued their life, and like it didn't really matter. All right. Aurangzeb was not nearly as exceptional as a king as most people today think he was, right? Like most stuff in India just like kept going as it normally had gone under him. What Aurangzeb did do, he did cut off all remaining links between the Mughal court and Sanskrit intellectuals. So that was 100 years of links that Aurangzeb sort of ended. That said, most of them had tapered off anyways. So more of a slow death. It's not like he fired 50 people from the court or something like that. But essentially, as I see it, Aurangzeb had no interest in Sanskrit literature, at least not as any kind of official Mughal project or something that the state would have a role in. And I think that had basically nothing to do with Sanskrit. I think that had everything to do with Dara Shikoh, right? His main competition for the throne. Dara had been into Sanskrit. Aurangzeb, the younger of the two, needed a way to distinguish himself from the man who was assumed to be the heir apparent for many, many years. And this was one of many strategies that he took, was, okay, Dara read a bunch of stuff in Sanskrit. We're going to get rid of all that. No more Sanskrit stuff for me. So again, that's a really, as I read it, a matter of internal politics. But I do want to underscore, while I wrote a book on Mughal Sanskrit links, that's not the predominant story of Sanskrit in the 16th and 17th centuries in India. Most of it had nothing to do with the Mughals. And I think that did not particularly shift or change. And I'll just add as a footnote to this, there is a scholarly debate about what was happening to Sanskrit in Sanskrit discourse during the 17th centuries, right? We have the death of Sanskrit thesis that the last sort of throes of real intellectual thought in Sanskrit are datable to the 17th centuries. Other scholars think that that is a mistaken view, to put it politely, and think that Sanskrit discourse continued unabated and was robust well into the 18th century. I do not actually have a clear opinion on that debate.
I think whenever someone writes a book, it's or when a society, right? Creates an atmosphere where one can write a book. There are economic incentives out there. For instance, when in the current 21st century, we have universities where scholars can do their research independently and write books. At that point of time, what were the economic incentives? Probably you were working under some king and you were probably biased by their incentives and hence you're writing books. But how many of them were actually independent?
That's a good question. So some Okay, the easiest case is the one that you name, where we have a Sanskrit intellectual working for a king. Now, I would caution against the assumption that all kings knew Sanskrit in pre-modern India, and certainly I would caution against the assumption that they were reading what their court poets wrote, right? In a sense, I get paid to write books by my employer, Rutgers University. My administration is not reading my books, trust me, right? So, there are different ways of negotiating that relationship, it's the assumption that kings controlled what their court poets wrote, I think, is a bad assumption, right? I think you should prove that if you think that that's true. That said, sure, I think when the king says, praise me, you praise the king, right? So one has to nuance that. That said, in the case of a lot of pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals, to paraphrase an old teacher of mine, it's unclear how they paid the bills. Right, and I remember this Sanskrit teacher of mine, Professor Larry McRae, talking about this with philosophers, particularly. Like, they're just churning out all these Sanskrit works, and how are they keeping the lights on? I guess there weren't lights, but how are they putting food on their table? We really are not clear on that. The last thing I would say is that sometimes there were religious structures. Okay, so Jain monks were supported by the community. Brahmanical scholars often worked in a matta system. So there are things like that as well. Diversity, I suppose.
Yeah, and would you say, most of this work were derivatives, because essentially they are being employed by the kings, and probably for what reasons? I don't know. If you know, you can elaborate on that. But essentially, what you're saying is that essentially these works are derivatives, because they are scholars on Sanskrit and they essentially know about it, so they are writing books.
No, I do not think that they're derivative. That is a well-attested view, starting in the colonial period and even going into today, that people hold about Sanskrit literature, that it was derivative in various ways. And I don't think that's accurate. I think that massively undersells the diversity and the innovation in pre-modern Sanskrit traditions. I think that innovation looked different in pre-modern Sanskrit. The norms were different. How you innovated, how you showed that, whether you hid it or bragged about it, that's all different than how we do it today. But there is immense innovation.
Okay, coming back to Shivaji. So Shivaji, being a Shudra king, wanted to be called as Kshatriya king. So how did his court historian help him doing so?
Oh, yeah. Well, he had a couple of court historians. So Shivaji, he was engaged in this sort of massive state propaganda project regarding his caste background. It's a great story for many reasons. It gives us many insights about his period. It's also one of those is it's a great story for people who still think that there was no caste in pre-modern India, which is an insane perspective. There was lots of caste. So as you say, he was Shudra, he was born Shudra. And what we mean by that, at least what I mean by that, is that he was widely perceived to be Shudra. I don't know, we're not going to get into his actual birth line, but caste is largely in the eyes of people around you. And Shivaji perceived that as a problem. And so he wanted to become Kshatriya. And what most scholars, I think, have focused on is his use of an invented conversion ceremony, essentially, to convert from being Shudra to Kshatriya. And I mentioned that in the book, but what I go over are how his court historians, I think it's particularly Paramananda, sort of does this and tries through Sanskrit literature to project Shivaji as a Kshatriya. And I argue, I'm forgetting all the arguments now, but at least two things that I argue are that one, he depicts Shivaji as this great warrior, right? And that's a key part of what it meant to be a Kshatriya in Shivaji's time, was that you could fight. And part of that was making out his opponents, right, which were often Muslim kings, to be real opponents, right? You can't say that these Muslims are terrible and they're no good to fight, because then where's the glory for Shivaji? So he made them into real enemies in his writing, which is reflective of reality as well. I think a second move that he makes is he depicts Shivaji very much as taking care of Brahmins and being talked about by Brahmins and caring about Brahmanical opinion. And I would caution that for any modern listeners who hear and bristle at that and think that that's offensive, that was a good thing in Shivaji's day and for his, I believe it was a Brahmin who was writing this stuff for him, right? So the inequality of the caste system was a virtue for a long time before people started seeing it as a vice.
Could you please elaborate on that? What do you mean by virtue?
Sure. Let me clarify. I don't mean in my own opinion, obviously. So the caste system has many defenders, and especially those who benefit from it today, okay, and people that want to perpetuate it, but they're generally ashamed of it, okay? Many people are, and so they try to hide it, right? Like, oh, I'm not trying to defend my Brahmanical privilege. You just, we're just going to say that caste isn't that big of a deal anymore, right? Or things like this. And that's because the caste system very clearly, for obvious reasons, clashes with some modern values, specifically concerning the equality of all people, right? There is fundamental inequality baked into the caste system. That's what it is. It's an expression of inequality put in a very formalized way. And so that's modernity. But when you look back at pre-modernity, many people thought that inequality was good, right? Especially Brahmins. So they're not ashamed of it. They don't talk about it in hushed tones. They scream it from the rafters, right? We are Brahmins and we are going to defend Brahmanical privilege. And that's a good thing because inequality is a good thing. That was their perspective. And in terms of, let me just say something in terms of how historians, or at least how I as a historian think about this. When I seek to understand the past, part of that, a huge part of that, is that I'm trying to reconstruct the worldviews of different people in the past, no matter how odious I might find them today, right? I believe very strongly in equality. But when I'm looking at the past, I bracket that in order to help me understand the views of those who championed inequality very strongly and wrote about this in their texts. I'm thinking of Jonaraja here. Jonaraja is like Mr. Brahmanical supremacy is good. That's like his shtick. And so I try to understand these views, no matter how much they might upset me today. That's part of what historians do. Understanding the past doesn't mean you condone it. It doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean that you promote it. It just means that you try to understand it.
So Sanskrit scholars at the beginning of 12th century used to compare Persian rulers with the evil forces of Rakshasas. Gradually, they started giving them respectable positions. Does it show the rate of assimilation of Persian culture with Sanskrit culture?
I don't know that I would put it in quite those terms, but I think it's certainly that general shift is dependent on increasing familiarity and increasing comfort. I think that's fair.
Right. Okay. So a couple of last few questions. So Audrey, being a historian and researching Sanskrit scripture, what challenges have you faced in your real life?
What do you mean by real life?
Real life, no, your life, I think. So challenges like researching, like there are a lot of criticism around the globe that like if you put certain point of view with your research, what you find, and you put forward, but certain section of the society doesn't like it, then you face criticism. Sometimes it's harsh.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean, I've faced, I think, pretty robust pushback against my scholarship and against what people perceive as my scholarship. I gotta say, if I had said like a quarter of the things that people think that I have said based on social media and WhatsApp chatter, I would hate me too. Folks, it's not real. Like the disinformation campaigns are very, very robust. So whatever you think you know about me is you probably don't. Just actually read my books. I think you'll be surprised at what's in there. So yes, it's hard. And I think I have a lot of things to say, but maybe I'll just say this since we've been talking so much about pre-modernity, which of course is my favorite subject and what I really love, is that's what the bulk of my research concerns. Right? I have secondary research interests in the modern day, but especially for a book like Culture of Encounters, it's about the past. Like that's the core of what I do. And so when modern people in modern times and modern nation states push back, it's it doesn't impact my views of the past. It doesn't soil pre-modern India for me. The India that I research is long gone.
So what's your future plan? Are you researching something?
So I am. So I have sort of two research projects going at the moment. The smaller one is I'm doing research on the US-based Hindu right and Hindu supremacist groups, which they're very unhappy about. So that is what it is. The second bigger project is that I am writing a single volume history of India or South Asia from the beginning to now. So I'll start hardcore with the Indus Valley civilization and then move on forward into the 2020s, whatever year I finish this book in. And that'll be published by Princeton University Press. I was recently awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Grant to write that book. So I'm working on it now. It's a bit slow going because I'm teaching this semester, but starting in January, I will not be teaching for a couple of semesters in order to work on the book. So I'm super excited about it.
Congratulations for the award and to write this book. And yeah, so I mean, how do you see this book as different from books written previously about Indian history?
So for me, this will be very different. It's broad and sweeping in its nature. It's also, at least at present, the vision is that it be fairly long, 600 pages, with images and maps and all of these things. This is very different than what I've written. And of course, it spans thousands of years. So this is not the detailed, granular, reading Sanskrit shlokas and verses like I did for the language of history. In terms of how I think it might be different from earlier overview books of Indian history, so it'll be the full shebang. No one's done that in a while. Okay? People tend to focus a little bit more, and there are good reasons for that. So we'll see if my folly turns out well or not here. As I mentioned, wanting to bring in South India more, that's a big thing in the book. Another thing is a diversity of voices. I don't want to only hear from men in the Indian past, and I don't want to only hear from Brahmins either, right? I really want to prioritize hearing from a diversity of perspectives in the South Asian past. And then the third thing that I'll name, which is perhaps surprising for a very textually focused historian like me, is that I want a diversity of types of evidence. Right? Texts don't tell us everything we need to know. There's archaeology, there's art, there's a whole bunch of other stuff out there. And to the extent that my own limitations and training permit, I really want to try to bring as much of that in as possible.
Yeah, that's great to hear, because there are a lot of archaeological evidence which does predate Indian history by a huge margin, and new evidences do come to the fore every now and then. So yeah, it's great it would be great to read your book. On that note, thanks Audrey for joining us and discussing about your book at length. It was really a pleasure to hear you to discuss about your book and Indian history and about Sanskrit literature of the past. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye now.
Bye. No.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.